What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some of my favorite games from Steam's Next Fest for February 2023 that is running from now, essentially, until next Monday, February 13th. And for those who might be unaware, I suppose, Steam Next Fest is a celebration of sorts of upcoming, typically indie titles on Steam, where they have tons of demos available for everything involved in this fest, which allows people to play them, take a look at them, wishlist them, check out the early access periods, etc., etc. So every time Steam does this, which is usually a couple of times per year, I like to take a look at some of what they have on offer, of course, and make a video about some of my favorites. That said, though, as there are demos available, I would encourage you to go check these games out for yourself and the festival at large, as they have literally a couple thousand demos involved in this, so there are tons to check out. But all of that said, I want to start out with a video game I have already covered, which is Dark Envoy. The developer behind this one sent me the demo a little bit early so I could put out an early preview of it. So I have a video where I talk about this one a little more in depth, but this is from the developers of Tower of Time, a well-received real-time with pause sort of dungeon crawler, with Dark Envoy being a somewhat indirect sequel to that title that expands on a lot of the features present in that first game, becoming more reminiscent of a typical CRPG or TRPG, but keeping the real-time with pause combat. One of my favorite things about this title and its predecessor, Tower of Time, is the AoE abilities that allow you to actually draw the area of effect, which can allow you to do fun things to manipulate the battlefield. But beyond that, we play as two twins who are salvage hunters that get caught up in a war between a highly advanced human civilization and a more primalist elven civilization. Overall, though, really cool. I'll absolutely be reviewing this one when it comes out, but you should definitely check the demo out, as it's a pretty cool title. But that brings us to our second entry, and this is actually Urban Strife. This is a game I had heard about a little bit here and there, but it looked a little rough around the edges. And even in this demo, I would say you can definitely tell it's an indie. But Urban Strife aims to be a blend of post-apocalyptic zombie survival, an RPG storyline, and turn-based tactics all in one. While the demo doesn't exactly explain how the apocalypse happened, zombies are everywhere. You get saved shortly after, which brings you into contact with a small settlement doing the best they can to survive, but it doesn't end there. While we don't see a ton of this in the demo, ultimately they're aiming for a more standard CRPG here, really. There's apparently going to be 3 factions that you can ultimately ally with, which will see you traveling around a city, exploring a host of locations, all while battling both zombies and other survivors via turn-based tactical combat, while also managing a few survival elements, which will see you rebuilding and expanding your base, adding in an element of base building, in a way that reminds me of honestly like isometric State of Decay, which isn't a bad thing. I enjoy the State of Decay games, even though I haven't covered them on the channel. That said, though, even from the demo, it's certainly a little bit clunky, even as far as these types of games go, so I'm curious to see how this one winds up panning out towards launch, as games in this genre tend to be difficult for indie devs to nail, especially right out of the gate. But that brings us to our third entry, and this one is Wandering Sword, which describes itself as a Chinese martial arts RPG where we play as a young swordsman caught up in a feud. After surviving a very near-death experience, we are put on the path of refining our own martial arts and combat skills to take revenge, it would seem, in what largely feels like a classic JRPG. There are a few things to note here that I think make this one especially interesting. For starters, the combat system. You'll be finding a bunch of martial art forms that you can upgrade on top of weapons that you can upgrade and use. There are multiple upgrade trees involving your actual base stats. So there's a good variation to the combat system just here in the demo. But what's more interesting than that is that while I didn't see it on display, personally, what they're planning is both real-time and turn-based combat, which will take place in a sort of arena. And I think it'll be especially interesting to see the real-time mode added to this, because if that is implemented well, I think it could be a lot of fun, because what little bit I played of the combat system here in the demo was enjoyable. The combat system itself seems like it has a lot of customizable elements to it. The world seemed interesting, much of which sees you traveling around an open world map to various hub locations, again, very JRPG. all of which makes for a great title to keep your eye on, as it's certainly showing a lot of promise, even just from this demo that I played, and it's feeling like a pretty smooth experience. But that brings me to the final entry on this particular list, and this is VoidTrain. VoidTrain is kind of like Subnautica and a couple of other games that you've kind of seen in that vein since then, but the premise of this one is that we are an engineer on an interdimensional train that we need to build up and defend. While we start the game with basically just a rail car and nothing else, we slowly start building up resources, constructing things, before turning our train into an actual proper train, and then ultimately getting the ability to explore and fight off more creatures. So while the beginning of this doesn't really see too much of that, you can't stray too far from the train, and there's not much in the way of immediate threats, some of the gameplay footage that they released alongside this later shows you building weapons and fighting off interdimensional creatures, while at the same time trying to figure out what happened, because your character was taking shelter in a cabin from a blizzard that then threw them into a portal along an interdimensional train. So certainly some curious stuff going on there, but overall the little bit that I played of VoidTrain was pretty enjoyable, and depending on how the late game pans out and where they take the story, I think it could be worth keeping an eye on, though it must be said Subnautica set a pretty high bar for these types of games, so we'll have to see if it can match up. Which brings us to the end of the video. Though ultimately, these games were just some of the ones I had the most fun playing and checking out, but as there are thousands of demos involved in Steam Next Fest, I could not possibly cover them all, so I would love to hear both what you think about these titles as well as any demos you've played during Steam Next Fest that you were particularly excited about down in the comments below, which means of course don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.